This is a short version of a talk I gave to QCC about how Freemasons Hall was used 200 years ago for non-Masonic events. I don't know if you've ever noticed that there are two plaques on the wall of the Connaught Rooms as you come along Great Queen Street. One of them relates to the Geological Society, which was founded in the Freemasons Tavern there in 1807. And the other relates to the Football Association, also founded in the Freemasons Tavern, but in 1863. And I've discovered that there were other societies too, including the Lawn Tennis Association, also having their first meeting in the Freemasons Tavern. So what was going on? It looks as if in the past, Freemasons Hall has been used quite a lot for non-Masonic events. Now, Masons of my age grew up never seeing anyone except a Mason in Freemasons Hall. That was the situation until 1985, when the Grand Master decided that it would be sensible if lodge public relations were improved and relationships with the press were improved, and that the Freemasons Hall was more open to the public. And so now, of course, we're accustomed to seeing people, including tourists, going around Freemasons Hall. But for many years, that was not the case. So I went back to when the hall was set up and first built in 1775. And for many years at that time, Freemasonry was much more open than it was after the First World War. Now, where does the evidence come from? Well, mostly from the archives of the British newspapers, either the Times archive or the main newspaper archive in the country. You have to look pretty closely for it too. But of course, it is only those events which were in the newspaper that are recorded. There must have been very many others that never got into the newspapers one way or another. Now, if we go somewhere for an event, provided everything works out, we're reasonably comfortable and satisfied, we don't really take much notice about where it was held. And that's probably why, apart from the records of invoices and so on that the Freemasons used to keep, there are no records, or relatively few records, left in Freemasons Hall. So we are searching for something like a needle in a haystack to find out what happened. But of course, before the internet, the traditional way that people found out about events was an advertisement in the national newspapers. I found about 2,000 references to Freemasons Hall in the Times archive over the past 250 years. And by focusing on the early years when the hall was built, I found that there were about 400 adverts relating to the period 1775 to about 1885. Now, I probably ought to say something about the importance of the Freemasons Tavern, because the site on which Freemasons Hall is built is very complicated. The current hall touches at its eastern end just about where the tavern was, and that area was in fact where all the earlier buildings were. But over the years there were all sorts of constructions there, and there were a number of fires. There was in fact a very serious one in 1883. So it's not as if we could think there was the present building, or indeed an earlier building, just there waiting to be used. It was only available for hire when that was possible. And the way the space changed over the years is quite a complicated story, and we haven't really got time to look at that now. But In the early days, the way through to the hall was through the tavern, which was on the frontage of Great Queen Street. And Grand Lodge leased the tavern to an innkeeper so that he would deal with the bookings. And from the 1770s, he and his staff were their agent for all the bookings, including the non-Masonic ones. Given that the first impression one gets in going to a place is always terribly important, and also that the food and drink is suitable and available and on time, you can imagine that this is an extremely important role. And of course it was one that didn't work out every time. There's quite a complex story about the way in which they had to change the innkeeper time and time again. But not only did they have the tavern and a hall, the first hall was built in 1775 to run, but for much of the 19th century they had a second hall too. Sir John Soames built a second hall next to the original hall in the 1830s, but it was unsuccessful. It was knocked down almost immediately after he died, and they tried again. And in fact, the third real attempt to have another hall still exists. It is in fact the current Grand Banqueting Hall in the Connaught Rooms. The great advantage that the Freemasons had in the 19th century with their hall was that there was no other suitable venue except those owned by the church and perhaps those Westminster Hall, none of which were neutral venues or indeed secular venues for people to meet at. And as there was a lot of pressure at that time for social change, those organisations and people who wanted to make change happen were very happy to meet in a neutral venue. Indeed, it enabled quite a lot of people who perhaps would never talk to each other in normal circumstances to get together and to get to understand each other. For example, right back in the early days of the 19th century, many people were horrified, as indeed we would be now, that small boys were employed to go up chimneys to sweep them clean. And there was at least one meeting to try and outlaw child chimney sweeps that was held at Freemasons Hall. The anti-slavery movement was also very big in the early 19th century. Newspaper records show that there were meetings at Freemasons Hall for about 50 years, from at least 1807. And it was that year that I found a newspaper record showing that the great and good of the country, dukes, the Archbishop of Canterbury, lots of other lords and bishops and MPs, including, of course, the famous William Wilberforce, and future MPs, Prime Ministers such as Robert Peel, were all there debating at Freemasons Hall. They sat in the same rooms as the Freemasons, and all this had the effect of helping to make Freemasonry more transparent all over the country, and therefore much more likely to be regarded as a normal activity for well-intentioned people. And of course, I'm sure we're all very pleased that Freemasonry was able to participate in something that is to do with the social progression. In 1840, the Times recorded that there was to be held at Freemasons Hall a World Anti-Slavery Convention, but there were other large meetings too. Of course, others may just have been dinners or committee-type events. No doubt they were held in small rooms in the Freemasons' Tavern. We just don't know. One thing that we do know is that Charles Dickens attended a charity public dinner at the Freemasons on at least 2 occasions. And he recorded the first time that he did it as a reporter in 1835. And that has been reprinted in his Sketches by Boz book. I shall just read from it now. Let's suppose you are induced to attend a dinner of this description. Indigent Friends Benevolent Institution. You deposit yourself in a hackney coach, the driver of which, no doubt that you may do the thing in style, turns a deaf ear to your earnest entreaties to be set down at the corner of Great Queen Street, and persists in carrying you to the very door of the Freemasons, around which there's a crowd of people assembled to witness the entrance of the indigent orphans' friends. You hear great speculations as you pay the fare of your being the noble lord who is to fill the chair. And so Dickens goes on to describe the bustle, the semi-organised chaos of the cloakroom, about finding his place in one of 3 long tables, with knives and forks which look as if they've done duty at every public dinner in London since the accession of George I. The company, the dinner, the interminable speeches, and the entry of stewards with a plate in their hands into which sovereigns and special donations are deposited, and so on. The other newspaper entry I spotted, which identifies Dickens, comes from the Waterford Times of the 10th of April 1863. There was a meeting of the Royal General Theatrical Fund Society, and the key speaker, the reason that people will come, was that Charles Dickens himself is the prime speaker. Dickens, of course, was very much an agitator for better social conditions, and this, of course, led to political action. And as I said earlier, in the 19th century, there were social meetings of many kinds at Freemasons' Hall. Here are a few of them. Between April 1792 and 1795, an organisation called the Friends of the People for Parliamentary Reform met, a group of politicians trying to find a middle way between radicalism and oppression at the time when the French revolutionary terror was at its height and was affecting British politics. They used Freemasons' Hall for meetings at least 5 times before the political debate moved on. No satisfactory middle way was ever found. Then there was the famous Anti-Corn Law League. That met at Freemasons' Hall for a number of meetings in the early 1840s until they were successful in 1846. And the Corn Laws were repealed, and that did away with the old protectionist agricultural arrangements and opened Britain up to free trade from across the world. For much the same time, their opponents, they were called the Central Agricultural Association, also met at Freemasons' Hall. They were for the protectionist approach. One can only hope that they perhaps didn't meet at the same time as the others. Their meetings ceased too, once the matter was over and done with. There were many religious and missionary societies who met regularly at Freemasons' Hall at this time, no doubt prompted to some extent by the concerns about their fellow men, whether living or slave, whether slave or living in what were then remote parts of the world. Many of these societies still exist, such as the Church Missionary Society and the British and Foreign Bible Society, which was founded in 1804 to produce Bibles in Welsh. So, the advantage for both evangelicals, Protestants, Catholics, and those of other persuasions in the religious area was that Freemasons' Hall was a neutral ground. It wasn't one of the Church of England places. So it was a neutral ground for many of the early discussions which eventually led to better understandings between what were erstwhile strongly opposed Christian organisations. But not everything was that serious and important, depending perhaps on your view of music. For example, there was a regular booking for the Academy of Ancient Music, which from 1784 used the hall for a series of public concerts. And indeed, it was in response to a request from them that Grand Lodge installed an organ in the hall. It cost 200 guineas. I don't know, but I can't help but wonder if this fairly random request is actually what instituted in Freemasonry the tradition of an organ available for use at lodge meetings. But there were many other types of meetings as well. I'll just list a few. There were even auctions. We call them perhaps boot sales. But early on, for example, the wheelwrights, coachmakers and harness makers met to discuss their need for financial assistance. Then a regular was the Smithfield Cattle Club show dinner at the tavern. During the early 19th century too, it seems to be the practice for certain schools and indeed Cambridge colleges to meet and have their annual dinners. Then there was a Burns night dinner I've spotted, and meetings of the Yorkshire Society, the Society of Ancient Britons, that's the Welsh, the Hibernian Society, the Irish, and so on. I hope this has shown how, undoubtedly purely by chance, the decision of Grand Lodge to build a Freemasons' Hall and then to recoup some of their outlay by the mundane and logical activity of trying to hire out the premises when it wasn't needed for their main task, has enabled a host of other organisations to hold their meetings conveniently. Thank you.